Good day, everyone. On behalf of Acting Director Ms. Kendall Ehrlich and Senior Policy Advisor John Markovic at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, let me welcome you to the Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance webinar on the role of body-worn cameras in public protests with a focus on small to medium-sized agencies. This is the second webinar we have offered on this topic, as we recently held a similar webinar with a focus on larger agencies. My name is Chip Coldren. I'm the Director of the Center for Justice Research and Innovation at the CNA Institute for Public Research, the Director of Technical Assistance for the Bureau of Justice Assistance's Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program, and I will provide the introduction for today's webinar. What a timely and important topic. We learned a long time ago that body-worn cameras touch on many, many aspects of policing and police practice. Here we have another example of an emerging issue in policing that body-worn cameras can play a helpful role in. Today's webinar focuses on this issue from at least two perspectives: research and action, actual policing experiences in small and medium-sized police agencies. The technical assistance team members and site representatives we will hear from today include Dr. Mike White from Arizona State University. In addition to many, many academic and practitioner-oriented accomplishments in the justice system, Dr. White is the co-director of our Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program, and he and his colleagues recently conducted a survey of the experiences of police agencies with the use of body-worn cameras in relation to public protests. Thank you, Mike, for your service on this project and for your participation in this webinar. Captain Wes Milam is the Support Services Division Commander within the Non-Uniform Bureau of the Fort Smith, Arkansas Police Department. He was instrumental in creating the body-worn camera program for his agency, launching the program in March 2019. His responsibilities include oversight of the 911 Communications Unit, Training Unit, Information Desk, Central Records, Quartermaster, Building Maintenance, and Animal Services. Captain Milam is a 17-year veteran of the Fort Smith Police Department and has served in numerous roles, including emergency management, community relations, patrol special operations, collision reconstructionist, and crisis negotiator. Captain Milam has a Master of Science in Criminal Justice from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and serves as an adjunct professor of criminal justice at the University of Arkansas, Fort Smith. Assistant Chief Lynn Waterworth is a graduate of Arkansas State University. She began her public service career with the Jonesboro, Arkansas Police Department in 1988. Being one of the first female officers at JPD has also afforded her the opportunity to become the first female to achieve rank at all levels in the department, up to her current rank of Assistant Chief. She holds a senior level officer certification and is a certified instructor who has instructed on a number of law enforcement related topics, including crime scene investigation, trauma-informed victim response, and media relations. Assistant Chief Waterworth led the department in achieving its first ever national accreditation through the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies and currently serves as an assessor for the Arkansas Law Enforcement Accreditation Program. She has also been active in and held office for a number of professional and civic organizations, including the Arkansas Association of Chiefs of Police, where she currently serves as a regional vice president. Thank you both for your service, for your participation on this webinar, and for your assistance in pulling it together. This is one in a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA for the Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program. We thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for its investment in the Body-Worn Camera Grant Program, in the Body-Worn Camera Toolkit, and in a range of technical assistance resources and opportunities for agencies implementing body-worn cameras. The Bureau supports state, county, local, and tribal law enforcement agencies in many, many ways. We are grateful to do. Please permit me a few other comments as we begin here. This webinar is recorded for the benefit of others who may view it later on our website. There will be opportunities for questions and participation at the close of the webinar, so please make your thoughts and questions known. I can assure you that others will appreciate hearing what you have to say. If you don't get a chance to voice your comments or questions, please use the chat utility, and we'll do our best to respond to your input. Now, let me also thank Bridget Bryson, Emma Wall, and Carrie Shelton at CNA, who do much work to make sure these webinars go smoothly. Now I'm pleased to turn the webinar over to Dr. Mike White. Mike?
Thanks, Chip. As Chip said, I'm a professor at Arizona State University, but I'm also co-director of our TTA program. And over the last 5 years, we have built a really robust network of grantee sites, law enforcement agencies from all over the country. And on a couple of occasions, we've taken advantage of that network of agencies to move quickly to gather information on a timely or critically important issue. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What we did is, shortly after May 25th, 2020, when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, we moved quickly to develop and field a survey that would really assess the interplay between the protests that were occurring in many cities across the United States and body-worn cameras. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So as I said, what we did is we moved quickly. We developed a quick survey that would take an agency about 10 or 12 minutes to complete. We then emailed that survey. It was a Qualtrics survey to all current and former TTA sites, so about 426 agencies. We sent that out, as you can see, on June 11th with a couple of reminders after that. And we ended up getting 100 completed surveys from current and former TTA sites, and depending on how you calculate that response rate, we're about at a 25% response rate, which is pretty good for this kind of effort. And as you can see, what we did is we broke down the 100 completed responses by agency size. As Chip had mentioned, I guess it was about 2 months ago now, we did a first webinar focused on the large agencies, those with 500 or more sworn. We had 18 responses that webinar that I included myself. The Assistant Chief Carroll from the Washington, D.C. Metro Police Department, as well as Professor Ed McGuire from Arizona State, who's an expert in policing protests. So what we'd like to do today is to transition and focus on the small and also then the medium-sized agencies, those that are under 500. And I should mention that we have 2 agencies as part of this presentation. The Jonesboro and Fort Smith both technically would fall into the medium category. Both are right around 165 to 170 sworn officers, but clearly they're on the other side of the spectrum in terms of agency size. Next slide, please. So these are the series of topics that we covered in the survey, and as I said, really what we wanted to do is just capture the landscape of what had been happening in jurisdictions across the United States that have been dealing with these issues. So we asked a series of questions about protests that had occurred since May 25th. We asked about the civility of those protests. And then we got into a series of questions about body-worn cameras, whether they were present, whether they were useful, what kind of issues or problems did agencies experience. And as I said, it was a relatively straightforward, quick and dirty survey. But as you'll see, we got some interesting results. So next slide. And one more, please. So let me walk you through what we're looking at on this slide, because there's quite a bit of information. So let's focus first on the left hand of the slide. This was simply the question, has your jurisdiction experienced protests since May 25th? And so you can see we've got the bar graphs that break it down by agency size. The all column or all bar would be all of those 100 responding agencies, and then you can see it by size. And so about 3/4, 75% of the responding agencies indicated that, in fact, they did have protests following May 25th. And you can see the variation across the agency size. The smaller agencies, only 64% indicated that they had protests, which compared to the large, medium, and large agencies is quite a bit smaller. But still, we're seeing that about 2/3 of these small agencies did in fact have protests in their jurisdiction. Moving to the right side of the slide, this is the question, okay, you had protests. Did you have officers at those protests assigned to those protests with body-worn cameras? And again, you can follow the same pattern. Among all 100 responding agencies, about 88% indicated that they had officers present with body-worn cameras, and you can see the variation by agency size. So, in fact, most responding agencies, regardless of size, did have officers at the scene of their protests with body-worn cameras. Okay, on this slide, we see some results with regard to body-worn camera performance at protests. So starting on the left side, we asked specifically for agencies to comment on the battery life as well as the recording capacity of their cameras. Were those sufficient? And, a little to my surprise, we found that most of the agencies indicated that things were just fine with regard to battery life and recording capacity. 81% total indicated no problems at all in those areas. And we do see some fairly significant variation here with the small and medium agencies aligning fairly well, with most reporting things are just fine. But you can see the larger agencies, 64%, only 64% said everything was good with regard to battery and capacity. So do the math. You can see more than 1/3 of the large agencies had experienced some problems in that area. We also asked the responding agencies about other technical problems or issues they may have experienced, so things beyond or not including battery and recording capacity. And you can see, again, most of the agencies that responded indicated that things were just fine. 78% said no other problems had occurred. And again, we see a similar pattern here with regard to the large agencies, with a significant percentage reporting other problems. These other problems, when we looked at the narratives that we got, the vast majority of problems that were reported by the large agencies involved mounting issues, and this was something we had discussed in the previous webinar with large agencies. So cameras coming off, or in a couple of cases, cameras being pulled off by protesters. So that was the majority of the other problems that were experienced. They involved mounting. There was a couple of responses about accessing footage as well. As I indicated in the opening comments, we also asked each agency to rate the civility of protests that they experienced on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being very peaceful and 10 being very violent. And so at the top, you can see among the 100 responding agencies, the average, the mean score was about 3.8. So clearly on the peaceful side, but perhaps to no surprise to anyone that's listening to this webinar, there was a pretty strong relationship between agency size and the level of violence at protests. As agency size increased, so did to the violence at protests, and you can see a fairly significant difference between small agencies at 2.9, so clearly at the low end, versus larger agencies, which were 5.9, moving up toward the violence end of the scale. I think this is, for us, one of the key questions, perhaps the key question: are body-worn cameras useful at protests? And 81% of all responding agencies indicated yes, that body-worn cameras were useful. This, of course, is assuming that they had cameras present, which most did. What's interesting, though, is you see some fairly significant differences by agency size, with small agencies, in this case, being the outlier. Only 59% of small agencies indicated that they believed that body-worn cameras were useful. When we looked at the narrative responses, the key theme that emerged was that many of the responding small agencies simply said they just weren't necessary. They didn't need to be there. And again, this may be tied to the civility of the protest that we saw on the previous slide. Medium and large agencies much more likely to indicate that they were useful. By far, the most common benefit, we asked agencies to tell us why they were useful or not. And by far, the most common theme that emerged was the evidentiary value of cameras, the ability of the camera to document and record both video and audio of what was transpiring at the protest. And that was the common theme across the board, regardless of agency size. Although a number of agencies responded, you know what, body-worn cameras are useful for everyday activities. They're also useful in the same regard for public protests. A couple more things before I turn it over to Captain Milam. Some other findings of interest. We did ask agencies if they had sent their officers to protests in other jurisdictions. And you can see it was fairly common among the responding small and medium-sized agencies to do that, about half of each. Less common among large agencies, which I think makes sense. You know, I'm in the Phoenix area, so we have, obviously Phoenix is the big police department, but there are a number of other cities nearby, and those smaller cities probably would send or did send officers to the larger protests in the Phoenix area. I think that's probably what we're seeing here. We also asked about activation. Is activation required at protests? And you can see that most agencies did report that activation was required. So the camera was activated in recording, though I should say, as you can see, live streaming was extremely rare. I think it was also rare for cameras to be rolling the entire time during the entire protest. Many of the agencies indicated that activation was only required if there was a formal interaction between an officer and a protester, not if the officer was just observing the protest. And then last, we also asked about complaints. If complaints had been filed against officers by protesters, and you can see none of the small agencies that responded had any complaints filed against officers at protests. 22% of medium-sized, but look at the large agencies. 2/3 of the large agencies reported that citizen complaints have been filed against officers at the protests. And this is where the evidentiary value of body-worn cameras really comes into play. There are numerous studies that have documented the evidentiary benefits of the cameras for adjudicating complaints against officers. Okay, so just a summary real quick before I turn it over to Captain Milam. So we see that regardless of agency size, most of the responding agencies indicated that they did in fact have protests during the summer of 2020. But it was pretty clear that the protests were both more common and more violent in medium-sized and also in large-sized agencies compared to the small agencies that responded to the survey. Again, complaints also more common. None of the small agencies reported having complaints filed against their officers. Most had body-worn cameras present at those protests. Most require activation. And again, most reported no problems with their body-worn cameras, particularly the small agencies. And most reported that the cameras were in fact useful. But again, the small agencies being a bit of an outlier. And again, the outlier response there was simply that they didn't feel they were necessary. They didn't need to have cameras at their protests. So those are the findings we have from the survey, and I'm happy to answer any questions after the other presenters. At this point, I'll turn it over to Captain Milam.
Thank you, Dr. White. As Mr. Calderon talked about at the beginning of the presentation, I'm from Fort Smith, Arkansas Police Department. We are on the western border of Arkansas with Oklahoma, being right across the river. Our city is just under 90,000 residents, but we balloon. We're a regional hub for a lot of industry, and we balloon up quite a bit during the work week. We have 164 officers, and just to give you a little background about our body-worn camera project, as was stated, we began it in March of 2019. We've started off with the Axon Body 2 cameras, and we have had, what most people listening in on this is understanding is funding for the body-worn cameras is something that was taken into account as we began our program. And once we did so, we only got a finite amount of storage that we got with the body cameras. Storage fees are something that definitely have to take into account, and that's something that we did. So we were relatively new with the body-worn camera project when we began to see the protest and the unrest arise in the summer this year after the events in Minneapolis with what happened to George Floyd. And like most other towns, we immediately began to see calls for some protest. And in probably about mid-May, we began seeing online an organization of a protest occurring on one of our major city streets. It's Rogers Avenue, but it's also Arkansas Highway 22, which runs right through the middle of our city, and it is a very large artery from the east and west getting into our city. It's a 5-lane highway, a very significant roadway, and the protest was scheduled to happen at the Chick-fil-A restaurant there in the town. Go ahead and change the next slide, please. As you can see here, this is as the protest began. Once we started hearing about this, we knew that due to the nature and volatility of the protest, it was decided within our command staff that we wanted to have as little of a presence as possible while still maintaining order. The fact that this was on a major state highway through our city, we were concerned, obviously, about the number of people dealing with the traffic and how to best do that and how to best let the protesters be able to have their voice heard and be able to get the point of the protest across while still maintaining safety. And as part of the protest was dealing with concerns with police uses of force and the police and community interactions, we did not feel that a large police presence was going to be needed. However, we needed to be prepared for that. And it was determined that we would only have 2 uniformed officers present at the protest while we still had ununiformed officers, undercover officers along the event, and we had a great number of uniformed teams outside the perimeter of the event, along with our crowd control team and our SWAT team available should something escalate. And as we were beginning to plan with this, we were discussing the use of our body-worn cameras and how we were going to deploy them into this scenario. Obviously, the first thought, as we are a new agency dealing with body-worn cameras, was, well, we just need to turn them on and keep them running the entire time. We just got 2 officers. But we started having concerns about the running the cameras for the duration of the event. The event was supposed to last about 4 to 5 hours. And running body-worn cameras for that much time, we began to worry about our storage, because as this protest was beginning, we were 14 months into our program, and we quickly realized that we had used up most all of our storage allotment and was over that amount as this started. So the storage issue was definitely a problem with how we deal with this. Go to the next slide, please. We determined that we would go ahead and have the officers with the body-worn camera, but we would only activate in the event of a citizen encounter. And we got the special operations staff, got with the organizer of the event. After that, we got permits, location, worked through the details. Next slide, please. As you can see, the protest ballooned very quickly to 500 participants. It was on both sides of this major highway. And not only were the participants on the roadway, as you can see here, but we also had many of the protest participants going back and forth through the crowd, honking horns in their vehicle And these two motorcycles guys you see here are one of the examples would continually drive back and forth through the protest. Next slide, please. This is one of our officers in the observation type of role that we had for our uniformed officers. It was a small presence there, and it was strictly in an observation capacity for this. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Initially, we had no problems. We were talking about, Dr. White talked about the civility of the protest in the small and medium agencies. Our agency noted that our protest was very civil in nature. There was not a whole lot of problems. We had two real incidents of note. The first one is this incident. As several of the protesters walked to the middle of the roadway, sat down, and then next slide, please. And of course, once that happens, the crowd then begins to increase into this roadway, at which point the officers, the uniformed officers on scene, began coming out from the perimeter into the crowd to try to work it out. And ultimately, the organizer of the protesters, the protest event, actually got into the middle of the roadway and told everybody to go back to the place on the sidewalk in the parking lot next to the roadway. She was explaining to them, it could be heard explaining to them, that this was not the way that they got their voices heard, and this was not the way that they got their point across, and that she wanted a civil protest and wanted people to do it the right way, and basically instructed them to move back. And so before the officers could even get there and activate their body-worn cameras, this incident was diffused very quickly. That was the main incident that we had, and the next incident, we had a gentleman that pulled into the crowd and was displaying large rebel flags on their vehicle and stopped at the stoplight there, which caused the crowd to immediately begin rushing to that vehicle. There was a confrontation really quickly. Again, prior to the officers getting there, the vehicle left the scene, and we were able to calm everybody back down and get them back in their positions. And our quick response teams on the outside of the perimeter was able to stop that vehicle and identify that person. The body-worn cameras were activated there for that officer. By and large, at this, after the several hours, this protest dissipated, and the crowd moved downtown to an area for another few hours, and we had absolutely no incidents for that. We had 3 more protests after this one, and they were significantly less in numbers than this first one. As I said earlier, this one was 500 participants. It was by and large the largest protest that we had. The remaining 3 we had ended up having 180 participants, then 160 participants, down to 60 participants. So in the weeks into June, when these protests were happening, it was every weekend, but as they started going, they reduced the number to we no longer had these. And each one of these, we were able to reach out to the organizers of the event and explain the situation, figure out what was done, and we maintained a very hands-off approach to this, and ended up to where they were very civil, and there was actually no body-worn camera use for the remaining 3 due to this level of civility in the protest and being able to get in touch with them ahead of time to have them understand where we were coming from, and that we wanted them to be able to make their statements loud and clear without any intrusion from us. And it turned out very, very well. We were very pleased with this situation. We were very happy with being able to facilitate these people making their voices heard, and they were very happy with it and commented on the fact that the reduced amount of presence was helpful and that it helped things out for that. So that is pretty much my perspective from the city of Fort Smith with regards to the protest that we had this summer. We'll certainly stick around later on, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Assistant Chief Waterworth from the other side of the state to get her perspective. Thank you.
As I said before, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this presentation and the other forums that have been presented by BJA. I've gained a lot of insight. As mentioned, I'm over on the other side of the state, northeast corner of Arkansas. We're about an hour or so northeast of Memphis, Tennessee. Our agency has over 200 employees with 170 sworn, serving a population of about 77,000. We are home to a university with about 14,000 enrollment, and so daily our population that we serve goes up. It was back in 2015 when the memories of Ferguson, Missouri were still fresh in everybody's mind that we first started looking at a body-worn camera program. And after some research, we did go also with Axon body cameras, as much for the capabilities of the software and its redaction capabilities as the cameras themselves. But every sworn officer has a camera, as well as some of our civilian staff. We were only able to do this because of the generous grant that we got from BJA that got the program launched for us. And it took us a few months to get things going the way we wanted. We refreshed training several times, but we were very pleased with the result. If you would go to the next slide, please. As with any infrequent event like these protests that took place earlier this year, it gives you the opportunity to kind of examine your preparedness and look some things over. And this included for us the use of our body-worn cameras. And following the death of George Floyd, we did have some localized protest events. And so it's those experiences that I want to share with everyone today. The first event came with not a lot of notice. We had a 24 to 48 hours notice. We do have city regulations that say if you're going to do any sort of a protest, a parade, or anything like that, that you have to register with the city. And although they didn't do that in the interest of protecting free speech, we were very lenient and didn't insist on any sort of an application being filled out or anything, and kind of just held off to see what might happen, if you will. It's important to maintain a balance between free speech and maintaining order, but still protect safety of the citizens. And while the courts have ruled that free speech has limitations, experience also makes it clear that it's best to give people the opportunity to voice their views, and that free expression is vital. In our grant narrative, one of the goals that we listed was actually improving the quality of service, not just from the standpoint of the officers, but also from the standpoint of the belief that the officers and the citizens they interact with would act better if they knew they were being recorded. And so for that reason, we tell our officers, if you are having any sort of an encounter with the public, any sort of interaction, turn your camera on. Doesn't matter if you think it's innocuous at the time, go ahead and turn it on. And so during the protest, we didn't give them any sort of instruction any different. And we found that usually they did the right thing and captured the things that were needed. On a kind of side note, when you talk about how much officer presence we had, we did have officers kind of, because our protest was mostly in a roadway, we did have officers kind of at the intersections trying to divert traffic away from the protesters. And the officers that we had are incident response officers, if you will, that were dressed a little more aggressive looking, were kept out of sight so as not to aggravate tensions that existed already. Over the course of about a week, we had different groups gather in different areas of town. Some of the protests were more organized than others. Some chose to march from one location to another. A few had just stationary gatherings. Altogether, there were probably about 5 or 6. The largest one, though, did take place on May the 31st, and that first crowd we estimated at 300 to 350 people. Now, that particular crowd chose to specifically target their site as being the police department. They started down the street a short distance, and then they marched to the police department and gathered on the lawn out in front of the police department. As the evening wore on, it started getting darker. You know, we were a little worried about the propensity of people to behave differently than the very civil response we had received earlier in the day. But we were fortunate that there were only a couple of minor things that went on. It also kind of opened our eyes to the importance of pre-planning for this kind of thing. And I will say just in the past week, we've had some pre-planning in preparation for next week, just in case. We did try to gather as much intel as we could on these events as they were forming. A lot of these formed over social media, and so it was, the afternoon of, they'd say, hey, everybody, we're going to meet at 7 o'clock, and so we had to really kind of gauge our response quickly, but make certain that we had a sufficient number of officers on duty, be prepared in case additional manpower became necessary and things like that. And we did try to have officers inserted into the crowd in plain clothes to try and keep a better eye on what was brewing. But for the most part, the groups were really, really peaceful. But much like in Fort Smith, our biggest challenge came when they wandered out into the roadway. We had incidents where they were laying down in the middle of one of the largest intersections in town, and it was important not just from the standpoint of keeping them getting hit by a car, but also they had a few among the group that tended to try and incite violence with people who weren't involved, just people who were there in traffic. And they would swarm out into the cars and randomly start yelling at drivers, and even went so far as to start slapping the cars for some of the individuals that were there nearby. And here you see what happens when you start having body camera issues. And this is one of the things when you start using body cameras, you have to not only worry about placement and things like that. In this particular case, what you're seeing is an officer's body camera view from the ground, because it got sheared off as he tried to intervene in what was going on. So kind of like the survey showed, these cameras do have some drawbacks. And you get this lovely video of the sky. Now, in this screenshot, it looks like the officer is about to get a really good video of what appears to be a situation that's about to escalate. But if you look there on the right-hand edge, you kind of see where there's an issue about to come up. So we train our officers, if you're getting out and you're going to work traffic, be mindful of safety and put on your traffic safety vest so that everyone can see you. But what you see happen is he forgot about the camera and the camera placement, and so the rest of what he records is the inside of his traffic safety vest. And this was kind of an issue later on because he was one of the officers that there was a complaint against him later on. And fortunately, though, we were able to clear that up through other video footage that became available to us. But he also encountered a man that he said he knew, and he knew from previous dealings with him that he was a Nazi, pledged racist person, and he's like, what is he doing in the middle of this crowd? And so capturing the presence of that individual could have been really important later on, but unfortunately he missed that. And so there on the top left where the circle's at, the traffic vest that you see is the traffic vest that's hiding the body-worn camera. And there's a lady who complained that officer had pushed her down, shoved her down, and in reality what you see is he's running, and it's not his foot that trips her, it's someone else's foot. And so, this is where we were kind of fortunate that we had other video available. But on the second complaint we had the body-worn camera footage available that cleared the officer in the complaint. The woman you see there in the center of the screen with her arm inside of her shirt is actually trying to pretend that she has some sort of a sling on her arm. And she's telling a large crowd gathered outside of our courthouse a couple of days after that initial event that one of our officers drug her out of her car by the arm and twisted her arm around, and she had just serious physical injury. And what you see in the body-worn camera shot is the same lady in her car driving away from the officer who told her, you're going to have to turn and go the other way. And that was all the interaction that they had. And because of the body-worn camera footage, we were able to clear that complaint very quickly and show that he never touched her at all. So from the complaint standpoint, it is a huge bonus to have that footage available. As a supervisor, man, it just makes it so much easier on you if you can say, oh, I've reviewed the video and nothing like what you're accusing an officer of happened. And one of the other big, huge bonuses to having that video available is evidentiary value for incidents that take place. The smaller photo there on the left is capture from some body-worn camera footage where some of the protesters got into it with one another. And our officers actually had to go over there and break up the altercation between them. And so it captures evidence of that altercation as well as the fact that the officers didn't do anything. The camera footage that you saw previously where it's coming up from the ground, if you look close inside that circle, you see what looks like little black dots. Those aren't actually birds flying overhead. Those are pieces of glass. The glass breaking incident happened when the crowd wandered out into the street, surrounded a family that was trying to leave the nearby Kroger store, and the dad chose to display a firearm in an attempt to scare the crowd back, and that signaled the crowd for some reason it was necessary to start breaking the windows out of his car. I'm not sure why you would break car windows if somebody had a gun, but that was their choice. But the officers who were attempting to intervene did capture on his body camera, even though it's laying on the ground, he did capture the fact that the glass breaking was taking place at that time, not something that happened later on as the people in the crowd tried to claim. So, again, the glass breaking incident was exacerbated because the crowd, was accusing the officers of trying to let the vehicle drive off. But in reality, what had happened was they had the tag number for the vehicle, and they felt like they were in a no-win situation. If we don't get this vehicle out of here, the crowd is obviously intent on bodily harm to this man, and so they chose to try and get him away from the crowd as quickly as possible by telling him, drive off, drive off, drive off. We did get it all cleared up later. He was contacted later, and we got that all taken care of. All in all, our city was really fortunate. The majority of what happened as far as the protests were extremely civil. Much like Captain Milan mentioned with their protests, we had an organizer with one of our largest protests who actually we loaned a bullhorn to so that she could tell the crowd, get out of the street, get out of the street. And when they would start yelling obscenities, she would actually start engaging them in a chant to cover up the noise of the obscenities and calm all that down. So the more impromptu gatherings were a little more challenging, but still not bad. And we had ample opportunity to address the crowd, engage the leaders. They were very willing to speak with us. We actually invited them to smaller conversations later on. And as we listened to what they had to say and discussed some of the events and the allegations that had been made, we actually discovered something remarkable that we hadn't expected. The general public was unaware of our body-worn camera program and had little understanding of it. And as we explained to them the compliance review process and how, the officer's camera footage is reviewed by supervisors periodically, it seemed to really put them at ease, and there was big value added to that discussion because they could see our commitment to transparency. Here and there throughout the presentation, I kind of mixed camera shots with some body-worn camera shots because I wanted you to see the things that the body-worn camera could capture and did capture. But this final photo for us kind of became very important to the message that was being spread on social media. And it's important as law enforcement that we remember that body cameras are not going to work magic. They just become another tool that we can use to benefit our agency and the community when we engage in genuine efforts to improve relationships. Our agency chose to use body-worn cameras. And it was not just to improve service, not just to follow up on officers, but to increase that transparency and improve our trust with our community. And reviewing the events that took place over those few days in May and June, I feel like the body-worn cameras have definitely helped us achieve that goal. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Coldren.
Let me first just once again thank Mike White, Captain Milam, and Assistant Chief Waterworth for their discussion and their presentation today. Very much appreciate hearing the perspectives, from the research side and the experiences from our colleagues in Arkansas. We have a little time to answer some questions or respond to some comments if there are any, and then I want to save a few minutes for John Markovic from BJA to make a few closing remarks. So if there are any questions, the floor is open. I know we got one question that came in from one of the registration forms, so I think I'll start with that. And the question is, in your opinion, what states have the best legislation, policy, and practices? For example, if we're trying to learn from others, who should be followed? So I'm going to just start off and say that's actually a pretty broad and, of course, an important question. And I think, you know, from our perspective, looking across the country, there's a lot of legislation that's been introduced. There's been an awful lot of work in the policy area. As a matter of fact, Mike White and his colleagues have been tracking the development of body-worn camera policy for the last 3 or 4 years, and there's some pretty good, very excellent documents on our website, actually, our TA website, regarding that work. But I think, you know, it's hard to answer a question like that regarding legislation because, quite frankly, I think there are different legal cultures in different parts of the country, and there's different paths to getting legislation passed. And the stakeholders who push legislation through are different in some states than in other states. So probably the best thing to do if you're interested in legislation is to look at the urban institutes. They have a website. They have been tracking body-worn camera legislation for the past several years. And I believe on this website you could track legislation by different categories in terms of activation, deactivation, you know, public release of video and things like that. So there's a lot of information available regarding legislation and regarding policy. I just don't think I'm in a position to say who has the best. You know, there are some states that are very prescriptive about this, and they'll mandate all agencies to have cameras, and there are some state legislatures that are much less prescriptive, and they allow the jurisdictions to, you know, determine needs by themselves. I'm really not able to say which is right and which is wrong, or which is better or which is worse, but there's an awful lot of experience out there. And if the person who submitted that question wants to, if they let us know where they're from, we can put them in touch with our technical assistance lead in that region, and they can probably point you to a few sites that they think have done pretty good work around policy and legislation. So, Mike, I don't know. You want to add anything to that, Mike? You've had a pretty good national perspective on things.
Yeah, Chip, I agree. I would echo your point. If you're looking at the state level, you're probably looking at too high a level. There is still fairly significant variation within a state on policy issues. So at the state level, that's kind of the bare minimums, and you can find agencies that have handled key policy issues very differently within a state. So I'd move down to the lower level and not focus on state legislation, but focus on particular agencies that you know, are the same size, maybe in the same region, and use those as guides.
Thanks, Mike. That's our response at this moment to that question. If that individual has other questions, please feel free to put them forward. I've got another question here that actually anticipates something I was going to delve into. But the question is, how have you balanced the release of body-worn camera video from protests with regard to freedom of information requests and protecting the privacy of citizens exercising their First Amendment rights? For example, redaction, decline to release video, and things like that. So I want to toss this question to Captain Milam and maybe Assistant Chief Waterworth. Have you had requests for footage from protests, and how have you been dealing with these things?
We've not had any requests for any of the body-worn camera footage from our protest. The way we would handle this is, as Assistant Chief Waterworth could say, Arkansas has a very strict, I don't know if it's be strict, but the Freedom of Information Act in Arkansas discusses what public records have to be released, and body-worn cameras is certainly a public record that would have to be released. And from our perspective at the Fort Smith Police Department, if any type of request comes in from the public for any type of body-worn camera request, we certainly are wanting to give them absolutely what they need. With regards to the First Amendment issue, I would believe that being in a public place and saying that is, their privacy wouldn't necessarily be much of an issue since they are in a public setting. However, if there was something, some sort of question about that, I know that we have the capabilities to redact identities within the crowd. It's only specific to the request. And I know that Axon has that ability for the redaction studio, but that would be something that I would suggest that if it was in a public setting and on a public right-of-way, then the First Amendment issue wouldn't necessarily be an issue that I would consider. Chief Waterworth, do you have a comment about all that?
Not really. I mean, I can't add much to what you said. I agree that Arkansas has one of the most liberal FOIA laws in the country. That we have to release pretty much everything, and so if we had received a request, we certainly would be releasing that. We wouldn't have any expectation of privacy in a public place like that. We do try to be conscious of the fact that, there are certain settings where, there is a certain amount of privacy in someone's home or a hospital or something like that. But the protests that we had were all very public and very open, so that really wouldn't have been a concern.
Great. Thank you both for that. Appreciate it. We have one more question. I want to put this question forth, and then we'll ask John Markovic to step in for a few comments. But the question is, what is the typical retention time for recording in general, and also those that are evidentiary? So this is another question where I think if you look across the country, you will find extremely broad variation in terms of mandated retention times. There are some jurisdictions I know of that are very particular, and they'll have different retention times for felonies and misdemeanors and certain classes of activities, and others will be much more likely to retain most things or everything for long periods of time. So it's kind of across the board. Mike, I don't know if you can add to this, but I hand this off to you again if you got a second.
By state, I mean, just in Arizona alone, for example, videos that don't have any evidentiary value, nothing formal happened. Generally, they'll be deleted within 180 days or so. But other videos are required by state law to be maintained forever. So, and I think you'll see that kind of variation state by state.
Yep. Okay, we actually had another question come in. I'm going to ask just Chief Waterworth and Captain Milam for a quick response to this. Then we'll go to John. But the question is, in any of your protests, did your agency make any type of public announcements that the crowd would be recorded via BWC, and or does your agency utilize any other type of video surveillance for recording protests or demonstrations? Let's go with Assistant Chief Waterworth first.
We did not make a public announcement. This is something that we do daily. It's part of our daily function. So these cameras are they beep. They're going to know that they're being recorded. So, no, we didn't make any sort of a public announcement. We do have some surveillance cameras at certain key intersections in town. In high-crime areas, there's about 10 or 12 of those. And there are also intersection cameras that the city maintains as part of their engineering program. They're not anything that are specific to protests, so to speak. But because these protests did take place in the street, some of it would have been on those cameras.
And as far as Fort Smith is concerned, no, we also didn't make any type of announcement. Chief Waterworth is exactly right. I mean, this was something that was pretty much well known. When we started in with our body-worn camera, we did several type of media releases and to let people know. And I think today's times in society, especially around our type of region that the public genuinely expects police officers to wear body cameras. There's any type of situation, that's the first thing they're asking is about where's the body camera video, and that was one of the important factors that we wanted to be able to to have body worn cameras is that need to be transparent and to have that. As far as the security cameras in Fort Smith, we don't have any type of surveillance cameras within our city. We are actually looking at adding some and seeing what the feasibility would be to be able to do that. But as far as Fort Smith, no, we didn't have anything like that.
Thank you very much, Captain. And let me just quickly offer my sincere thanks to all of our panelists for the webinar today. Very much appreciate your participation in putting this whole thing together and your presence today. Special thank you to all the participants and the question askers. Very good questions, and really appreciate the participation today. Let me pass this to John Markovic, our friend at BJA.
First, thanks to the CNA team for putting together another smooth webinar, and to Dr. White for giving us the research background, Assistant Chief Waterworth, and Captain Millam for giving us, I think, a really on-the-ground perspective of how body-worn cameras can be used in ways that benefit the community and benefit the police department at the same time. I just would want to emphasize one thing related to one of the questions. I think Mike made a great point that you should look at the localities around you that are similar to you in terms of what they're doing with policy, the procedures they're using with deploying body-worn cameras. But it is important to remember at the same time that states are increasingly creating laws related to body-worn cameras, and those laws generally set the floor, not the ceiling. So with respect to retention, some states specify minimum retention amounts by the particular type of event, whether or not it's evidentiary, as Mike suggested, would lend to the fact of whether or not it's kept longer or shorter was the requirement for the retention. So, and I think there's the interesting question about Freedom of Information Acts, and some states lean towards open records laws. Other states lean towards treating body-worn cameras as evidence, and really the onus is on the requester to justify why they need a body-worn camera footage. So again, you should be following, and that's one of the requirements of our program, is that you're aware of and that you follow the state laws, one of the requirements of our grant program. So I think in closing, again, I want to say thanks. Stay tuned for more webinars and check out the body-worn camera toolkit, the resources that are listed on the slide now, the TTA Assistance website, and don't hesitate to reach out to CNA. They're there to help. So there's pretty much no questions that they will leave unanswered. They'll try to give you assistance if you ask for it. So thanks, Chip. Thanks, everybody. And with that, I'll say goodbye.
All right. Thanks again to my friends at CNA for making this webinar happen. Take good care, everybody. Thanks for joining us today.